All right, here we go. Welcome to Shar Yichud V'Emuna, our Tanya class. Last week we gave an overview of chapter 7. It's actually, as I mentioned last week, it's the longest chapter, not only of this section of Tanya, of the second section, Shar Yichud V'Emuna, but it's actually the longest chapter of the whole Tanya. So it's very deep. I've myself tried to learn it a few times, even before we started this section. So I'm talking about a few months ago. When did we start? Maybe when did we start Shari Chizbamuna? 5, 6 months ago?
5 or 6 months ago. Wow.
I was consulting with friends, for resources, tools, tips of how to give it over. And they said, until chapter 7, you could do it. After chapter 7, they said, good luck. Because it's very deep stuff and trying to understand. So as much as I can from teachers that I, studied with as a yeshiva boy, and even now we continue to study. I'll give it the best I can. Welcome to ask questions. We'll try to learn some insight, but maybe just the practical points, the Hasidic thoughts and practical lessons. My goal is after we finish this section of Tanya to move on to a favorite book, which is called Shar HaBitachon, which means the gateway, the gate of trust in God. It's a really old book. While the Tanya is maybe 225 years old, Shara B'tachon is like closer to like 900 years old. But it's so relevant and so meaningful. I saw a video of a woman, a soldier in the IDF, an American soldier that is a lone soldier, and she's holding up this book, and she says, "This is keeping me strong." So it's definitely an appropriate book.
For Israel.
Exactly. And so when we get closer, I'll send out a link. I recommend having this book, regardless of if you come to every class or not. It's a really good book. So that's gonna, God willing, be the plan sometime in the near future, in the next month or two. But for now, we're still going to try to tackle our way through the last sections of Shar Hayichud V'Amuna, the gateway of unity and faith in God. So here it goes. We basically gave an overview last week of chapter 7. I left out the last 10 lines of chapter 7, the last section of chapter 7, because it's really deep and it would have been a little bit too much to cover in the material we already tried to cover. So the second half of chapter 7 was actually not even printed for the first 100 years after the Tanya was published. It wasn't included in it because it was so deep and subtle and nuanced that a person could misunderstand it and have a whole different understanding of God. Therefore, you have to be so careful on how to learn it that for the first 100 years, it was actually just taken out until the fifth Chabad Rebbe, whose name was Rabbi Shalom Dov Ber. He was known as the Rebbe Rashab. He passed away in Russia, in Rostov, in 1920. He added it in. He put it back in and saying, now it's right. We're ready to understand it. We're ready to, tackle it as well. In this section of the last few lines of chapter 7, it includes one of the most fierce debates in amongst Kabbalists and even amongst Hasidic circles and the Chassidim opposed by Misnagdim, which we'll get to in a moment. There was a fierce debate in Kabbalah and till modern times of a certain concept in Kabbalah that's known as Tzimtzum, which we've always interpreted it as, translated as divine concealment or a squeeze or a contraction of God's light in order to be able to come to a lower place. So the idea of Tzimtzum, which is this divine contraction, and we've studied it in the past few chapters, was actually not even mentioned in the earlier books of Kabbalah. If you go back, Kabbalah is thousands of years old. Kabbalah is the mystical dimensions of Torah, the esoteric teachings of the Torah. But if you look in the Zohar, which is the foundation book of Kabbalah that was authored by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, he doesn't even mention the word Tzimtzum.
It's a book of splendor, right?
Yeah, but he doesn't mention the word Tzimtzum. Tzimtzum, concealment, only was introduced by the Arizal, whose name was Rabbi Isaac Luria, and he was another important, one of the most monumental person of introducing Kabbalah to the world, but he lived 500 years ago. And he's the first to even talk about Tzimtzum, which means God's divine concealment. In the Tanya that we've been learning over the past few weeks, Tzimtzum is a very relevant topic in explaining about Tzimtzum, but the last few lines of chapter 7, we get into a core um, um, way of understanding Tzimtzum. And so I want to put that on pause for a moment and go a little bit back in history. During the times of the Alter Rebbe, there was a fierce debate and disagreement in the Jewish world between the Hasidim, which were literally Hasid is a pious one, that go above the letter of the law. That's literally the definition of a Hasid. That was introduced by the Baal Shem Tov. He passed away in 1760, and he was succeeded by his disciple, who was known as the Maggid. His name was Rabbi Dov Ber. Both of them lived in Ukraine. And then they were succeeded by the Alter Rebbe, who authors our Tanya. There was a big opposition during those generations to Hasidus, and the opposition called themselves Misnagdim, which means the opposition. Literally, a neged is an opposer. They disagreed vehemently with the ways of Hasidus, with the change of the status quo of how Torah is learned. And we're not going to get into this. Is not going to be a class about their differences, but it wasn't just a difference of custom. It wasn't just a difference of behavior. There was a lot of ideological differences between them. And one of the main ideological differences, the fierce argument that was an ideological argument, was when the Arizal talks about Tzimtzum, when the Arizal spoke about God's divine concealment, did he mean it literally or not? In Hebrew or in Kabbalistic terms, the argument is Tzimtzum kipshuto? Is Tzimtzum, is the divine concealment literal? Or shelo kipshuto? Or is it not literal? So the argument came as a result of the Arizal, who wrote about Tzimtzum. He writes about he actually doesn't write. Let me rephrase that. He taught about Tzimtzum, but the Arizal, he never wrote. The Arizal spoke, and it was jotted down by his students, and later it was compiled as books and writings by his students, the main one being Rabbi Chaim Vital, which is quoted a lot in our Tanya. Actually, in the first chapter of the Tanya, the concept of two souls, he quotes from the Arizal, from Rabbi Chaim Vital, talking about one of the soul that is the animating one, the soul with animalistic instincts, the animal soul, the Nefesh HaBahamis. It talks about its qualities, and he quotes that from the Arizal. But the Arizal never wrote it. They say the Arizal, he thought so quickly that he couldn't be limited to writing. It says he would sweat so much when he would teach, like he was in a different world. So writing was not something he did, but his students wrote. But he died tragically in 1572 when he was only 36 years old. Could you imagine? Rabbi Isaac Luria died, one of the greatest contributors of the study of Torah. He died 36. So after he died and they were compiling his teachings, they were compiling about Tzimtzum, which is about this divine concealment. But the debate amongst the students already were, what did our teacher mean when he said that there's a divine concealment? Is it literal or not? And that was already a debate from the late 1500s, early 1600s. And that continued into the 1700s, where Hasidim, or the teachers of Hasidus, Baal Shem Tov, and we're going to see now the Alter Rebbe, they all were adamant that Tzimtzum is shelo kipshuto. Tzimtzum cannot be literal. And I want to explain to you what that means. So when the Arizal spoke about Tzimtzum, what it means is, in Aramaic terms, if God's light is infinite, you can't get a finite world. We live in a finite world. If there's infinite, you can never get from infinite to finite. It remains infinite. That's the definition of infinite. There's no end to it. So how do you get to the end of infinite, to the place where finite could start? How do you get from God's infinite light to a finite light? So in order to do that, God had to kind of remove his infinite light. In the Aramaic terms, it's a makom panui. There had to be a vacant space that God left in his infinite light, a space that was empty of his light, that God vacated, so to speak. And that's where a finite world was able to emanate from. So that was the Tzimtzum. The original Tzimtzum was a vacant space that God had to leave in his infinite light, that God wanted there to be a finite world. And that came through Tzimtzum, through this open space. But did it really mean that God vacated? Or did it just mean that God concealed? Is Tzimtzum, which means God's contraction or God's removal, did God literally remove light? Or did God just conceal light? Like, when your arm is sleeping, you could have an arm that falls asleep. It doesn't mean that it's paralyzed and it can't move anymore. It just means that it's sleeping. That means it just has to wake up. So did God just conceal his light that's hidden? It's like sleeping, so to speak, to allow this finite space to move to come into, or did God fully remove his light? Misnagdim said it's literal. The opposition of Chassidus were of the opinion that it's literal. The Vilna Gaon, and many people, for those that are familiar a little bit with the debate between Hasidim and Misnagdim, a lot of them look at Misnagdim as people that had no concept of Kabbalah, or that were opposed to the ways of Chassidus, were very literate in Torah knowledge, but not literate in the mystical dimensions of Torah. But that's not true. The Vilna Gaon, who was the genius of Vilna, who was considered to be the chief of the Misnagdim camp, who was an incredibly holy teacher of Torah, and he was a Kabbalist himself. I went to his grave when I visited Vilnius in Lithuania. I went to pray by his grave. He was an incredibly holy teacher of Torah, both Talmud and also Kabbalah. So Vilna Gaon, the genius of Vilna, he famously said that God wouldn't reside in a place of filth. Think of a garbage dump. Could you think of God there? It's a violation of God's honor. So therefore, their camp, the Misnagdim, were of the opinion that Tzimtzum has to be literal, because otherwise you're saying God is residing in a place of filth. That can't be. That's inappropriate. It's a violation to God's honor. That a place of klipa should have godliness residing there is just, it's not covet. It's not honorable to God. Therefore, God removes his energy and God creates from afar. That was the way of Misnagdim. Now, of course, having been in this class for months of learning Shari Yichud V'Emunah, we know that that's definitely not the way of Chabad, because our way, and the way we're going to bring it out again today, is that God is intimately involved in every detail of the world, everything. But that includes Klipa. And there's a big camp that says that it can't be. That's an insult to God. God doesn't reside in Klipa. God doesn't reside in filth. So therefore, God creates from afar. So Tzimtzum, according to them, was kipshuto, which would mean Tzimtzum was literal, which means God's removal of his light was literal. There's still an energy of God, but it's not God in his infinite light. It's God removing his energy and creating from afar. Hasidim argued the exact opposite. And they have proof from the Zohar, which is, like we mentioned before, the cornerstone books of Kabbalah, where it says, Ein atar panoi minei. There's no space that is void or vacant of God. God, it fills every space. We have the verses that says, Milo kol haaretz kavoda. We say kadosh, which means God is holy. He fills, the entire world is filled with his glory, with his honor, with his light. Right? Es hashmayim v'ta'aretz ani malei. God says in the Tanakh, heaven and earth I fill. God is everywhere. God is as much in Klipa as he is in Kedusha. That's the Hasidus perspective. So that was a huge debate between Hasidim and Misnag. So it wasn't just a debate. It wasn't like a Chassid and a Misnagid. They could get together and they have an argument. They looked at the other person as a heretic. That's how far it went. And therefore, we know that in those days, talking about the the late 1700s, if a person from a Misnagid family would marry a chassid, they would sit shiva. Not just because their style is different, not just because their prayer book is different, but because they're a heretic. That's how they looked at them. And I want to tell you why they looked at them as heretics, and if you have any feedback on it. But just imagine a conversation going on between a chassid and a misnagid in the late 1700s. They have the Vilna Gaon, who says Tzimtzum is literal, which means God vacated. God had to remove his energy not to be in a place of filth, in a place of klipa, and God is creating from afar. And then you have the Tanya, that in chapter 7, which I'm giving you an overview of, and chapter 8, he says it's not kipshuto. God didn't literally remove his energy. So imagine a conversation. A misnagid who followed the ways of the Vilna Gaon comes to a chassid and says, do you say God is in a church? Do you say God is in filth? And the answer of the chassid is, of course. He's in a church as much as he's in a temple. He's in a garbage dump as much as in the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. God is everywhere.
He even says, I'll bring the nations to
Yeah,
Mount,
yeah,
and everyone will celebrate.
right.
Yeah.
So the chassid would say, chassid, you're a heretic. And the chassid would ask the misnagid, what's your opinion? Would you say, would God enter a bathroom? And the misnagid would say, no, we don't put a mezuzah on a bathroom. It's not honorable to God. And you say God is in a bathroom, it's not bekavadik. So then the chassid would say, you're a heretic. You're saying God is not in every space. So they were both looking at the other one as a heretic. You're saying God is in klipa. You're a heretic. You're saying God is not in a garbage dump. You're a heretic. God is everywhere. So this was huge, and it gets to the core of the understanding of God's relationship to the world. How does God interact with the world? The whole book is called the Gateway of Unity. So talking about unity within God and unity of God interacting with world, which is where chapter 1 started. We started with God interacting with world in the unity, and now we're talking about within God the unity, and us with God, and then God with his attributes, with God with his names, God with the angels, the unity that exists in every dimension. So the Alter Rebbe says at the end of chapter 7, after understanding what unity means, we can now understand better the concept of tzimtzum that is not literal. That is, it has to be shelo kipshuto. It has to be not literal. And for those that say that tzimtzum is literal, are mistaken in the words of the Arizal. They made a mistake. Because number one, you can't say that God, um, let's just say this, fundamentally. So here's the deep idea of why we can't say God literally removed himself. Number one is because God doesn't take up space that he has to remove. God is everywhere. But more fundamentally, God knows everything from within himself. God is aware of all change, and yet it doesn't change him. The famous verse of the Torah is Ani Hashem lo shaniti. I am God, God says, and I don't change. We know our world is constantly changing. Everything changes in the world at every moment. And yet, God, the creator of it, it doesn't change him at all. If God is involved in creation, you would think it does change him. So we're going to be introducing a very famous Rambam to explain it. And let me put that on the side for a second. Let me just go back to the Chassid and Misnagid argument. Chapter 7 and chapter 8, the argument is, how do you view the world? Let me try to put it in terms, because it's very deep ideas. But is it a godless place that our job is to bring godliness into it? Or is it a beautiful place, divine and holy place, full of godliness, that we just have to reveal it? If you say that Tzimtzum was kipshuto, which means literally God removed himself, that means this is a godless place, and our job is through Torah mitzvot, we're bringing God in, we're introducing God to the world. But Tzimtzum shelo kipshuto, which is the Chabad and Hasidus perspective that is so true, means that God, this is a divine place. It's just God concealed his energy, and our job is to reveal it, uncover it. But it's here, it's in everything, it's everywhere. So essentially, this idea is going to be the highest understanding of God's unity. That our whole existence is one and the same with God. It's not that we have our existence and we have God that we worship, is that we're all within God. That this whole world is godly and this whole world is God. And we just have to reveal it. Because the whole Tzimtzum is not literal, which means the whole concealment didn't really change God, obviously. And therefore, God's essence is present right here. And just a simple proof to this, I'm not a mathematician, and I'm actually, even now, my Hadassah is in 8th grade, and she brings math homework, and I'm like looking at it. I'm expected to remember, what these how this process works. So I don't know if anyone else has that issue with doing homework with their kids when they're coming back. I'm with these math homeworks, but the simpler a math problem is, the more vast the audience that knows it. The more complicated it is, the more narrow the audience. So take 5 plus 5 is 10. So many people are able to come up with that. But if you do, what Adasa had last night in homework, I can't even talk about the problem because it's too complicated for me to even explain. But like if you go to 8th grade or 11th grade math, it could be you have a more narrow audience of people that are able to understand it and do it easily. So the more abstract something is, the narrower the audience. So how is it that everyone has an opinion on God? It's not that, we leave that for the elite that understand God. Everyone talks about God, whether they believe in God or they don't believe in God. They have their proof of why there is a God or why there isn't God. Because even though God is not revealed in the world, meaning we have to reveal God's presence, but God's essence is here. God never left this world. God literally, when we say literally removed himself, that's definitely not the way we look at it, where God just hid himself. God is always here. The world doesn't change God. True unity would mean to see, which is what this book is all about, is seeing this dimension of God within everything. Because God is the true presence of everything. God, in everything, in their essence, you'll find God. Any questions before I continue? I know it's pretty deep stuff. I'm trying to explain the best as I can.
When you were saying about dumpsters and bathrooms, if God is there, so what's the final answer? Is God everywhere? Is God somehow there, but in a dignified way somehow, or is God not there at all?
So based on Tanya, if you're a chassid, the answer vehemently, like adamantly, is absolutely God is there.
Shows all world.
There's no place in the world that is if you say God is everywhere, but just not in 1 inch of space, that's not God. That's not God's energy you're talking about, because God is everywhere equally, which is a fascinating idea. So then, obviously the question would be, then why do we go to the temple? If God is everywhere, and in the synagogue as much as in my home, why do I need a synagogue? Why do I need a temple? Right? If you remember the last few chapters of the last section of Likutei Marim, the first section of Tanya, chapter 50, 51, 52, it was actually explaining this idea that God's energy to the world comes through Ishtalshalut, comes through Chachma, all the way through, and then it goes to the Malchus of that world, and that goes via the temple of that world. So our practical temple is the anchor, is I had a better word when we learned it, is the bridge to God's world, to God's energy coming to the world. But God is in essence here, maybe more revealed in the temple, and that's why we don't put a mezuzah on the bathroom door, because it's not honorable to God, to God's name. But God absolutely is everywhere. So the Chabad or the Hasidus, and maybe we'll learn those few lines of Tanya together. It's one of the most fundamental concepts. Like if a person starts learning Kabbalah and they go to Israel and they say, I'm learning Kabbalah, they'll have a sign that says, I learned Kabbalah. The first question they're going to ask you is, so what's your opinion on Tzimtzum? Is it Kipshuto or Shalo Kipshuto? Is it literal or not literal? That's one of the most fierce debates on the Arizal's teachings, is what did he mean when he said Tzimtzum? And the Baal Shem Tov and the Alter Rebbe here is making our point that it has to be Shlo Kipshuto. Maybe we'll read those lines together because it's such a fundamental thing. It's a complicated concept, Michelle. But as much as I can, I'm trying to explain that it is shlo kipshuta. It's not literal, which means God's presence is here. God never changed, which is a verse of the Torah. And everyone would agree with that God doesn't change. But the idea that God in His essence is here, as much as anywhere else, is the true definition of unity within God. That God is everywhere. Yes, Shira.
So Hashem fills all worlds. So we know that.
Yeah.
So He also gave us free will.
Yeah.
We could choose right or wrong. So if a person chooses wrong and commits evil, Hashem is still there surrounding that person.
Of course.
With the choice of that, because He gave them free will, but He's not there when they actually commit the
God is there. God is still there.
That's what I'm asking.
Yeah, God is still there.
So if someone commits murder, life is most sacred, right?
Yeah.
So if someone commits murder, Hashem is still there when they commit murder.
Yeah. They have the free will, and therefore
Because
they
the free
chose
will's
to do
not
something.
withdrawn. It's
Yeah.
always there. Okay.
Otherwise, it would be angels if they didn't have the free will. He's got everywhere to the same degree. Adrian, great question. Adrian had a birthday last week, and so much wisdom came with the new birthday. So thank you, Adrian.
Wisdom.
God everywhere. What do you think the answer is?
Yes, but it's concealed in some places.
Yeah. If God wasn't the same degree of God, the presence, take a king. The simple understanding is a king, when you're in the presence of the king, there's an awe. But when you're in your home, you still have to be careful and respect the king, but the awe is not there the same, right? The unity of God that we're trying to come up with in Tanya is that God is as present with you and in that place as He is in the heavens. There's no difference at all. So God is the simple answer to your question is in the chat is yes, God is equally everywhere the same.
But what about, say, a table and a person?
A table and a person?
Yeah.
So we did talk. I forgot what chapter that is. That's a very good question. God gave from Himself a soul to people, but so let me just answer that question. There is a difference in our relatability to God, how it is in a table and how it is with a human. When God created Adam and Eve, he created them from His innermost part. He breathed into them, right? The neshama means a breath.
Yeah.
And that's where we get a soul from. That's why neshama means a soul, because it comes from the breath of God, which is from God's inner part. When God created the world, like a table, like you said as an example, He spoke with the letters of the 10 utterances of creation, which is the outer part of God. A person could talk a lot longer without the need of taking a breath. Whereas if you're blowing, you lose your breath much quicker because it's coming from inside. So the speech, which is how God created the rest of the world, is from an outer part of God. And the soul, which is
like our animals aren't they came from an utterance?
Yeah. Right, animals, right? They were created on the morning of Friday morning when God said, let there be animals, right? Humanity, Adam and Eve, are the only ones that were created from God's breath, right? Neshama. So, Adrian, your question is very poignant, is very on, because originally your question was, is God everywhere? But then you're asking, is it the same in a table and a... So, the answer is yes, God is everywhere equally. The souls is not a creation, it's part of God. So it's not a creation that God did, it's part of God's essence.
Did you
Yeah,
say
there's definitely
different
more.
aspects of God?
So it's you're putting me in a good corner, because as long as soon the whole point of the gateway of unity is to say that every dimension of God is one with God. The unity doesn't just mean that God is one and not two.
Mm-hmm.
That's a child knows that. When we say unity, we're talking about a deeper dimension of unity, which is that every aspect of God is fully one with God. God's, and that's going to be the next chapter. Um, it's all one in point with God. Yeah, there's a lot more to talk about, Adrian, on this. And yes,
Okay.
Lynn, and then Sherry, yeah.
Thank you.
So my question is, when we hear like the Chabad saying to make a home for God, right? Or to bring, so I like where you were saying that God is always here, and it's just, so are you saying just it's that our place is to reveal what's already here? And so it's, because otherwise I was thinking, okay, or do we become the light in the darkness, meaning that it's not here? So could you kind of,
Yeah, but
With
even
that-
the question you just asked was so beautiful, because when you say darkness, by definition, that would almost mean that God is not in the darkness, and we have to be a light. But the beauty of what we're learning now is that God is in that darkness. Actually, the wording of King David in chapter 18 of Psalms, he says famous words is b'machchakim, which is it comes from the word choshech, which means darkness. Hoshivani, you brought me. And there's darkness, and then you bring light. But then there's even a higher level of darkness that is place that is beyond the light, higher than the light. If you look at a candle, you have the flame, but then the closer you are to the wick, it's darker. The color of the flame is not bright, it's blue, or it's black, it's a darker color. And the beauty of learning this is that even within the darkness, thank you, Tim, even within the darkness, there's God. And sometimes within the darkness, the energy of God is that's really the unity, is seeing God in that darkness in Tzimtzum, as much as you do in revealed, as much as you do in holiness. So yeah, I don't know if I answered your question, but that's one point of it.
so let's say we go to Israel and we've been saying we studied Kabbalah, so I'll never
Yeah.
say that. But if they ask us the test question,
Yeah,
is it literal or not literal? We would say Tzimtzum is not literal, because
exactly.
that is, I just wanted to make sure, I'm just trying to track
Yeah.
with you. So thank
Yeah,
you.
yeah, because it's not literal. Because if it was literal, then you're saying that there's a place here that doesn't have the same energy of God as a place there.
Doesn't have God's
That God
energy.
removed his energy in order to create. So when you're saying God didn't remove himself, which means Tzimtzum, God's removal is not literal. What you're saying is God is in Klipa as much as he is in Kedusha, which for the Vilna Gaon, as I said earlier in the class, that's not honorable. God is in a bathroom. We don't put up a mezuzah in a bathroom. So it sounds heretical to them. Whereas for us, for Chassidus and Tanya, to say God is not in the bathroom, that's heretical. There's no place that is empty or void of God, which means God is equal. God is everywhere.
Sure.
That's the unity of God, seeing godliness everywhere. Shira, yes.
Just the book talks about sticks and stones. And it talks about how Hashem is everywhere, which we know, right? So he created sticks and stones. And so then the argument comes forward, do you worship sticks and stones? Like idolatry, right? And the sin of the golden calf, and it talks about that. And I was just wondering if you could comment on it. My take on it is Hashem blew himself into us, and he's holy, right? And then the golden calf, which he created, right, or gave man the ability to create, was there, but it wasn't it's not him, because he didn't breathe himself into it. Does that make sense?
That in stone, you're saying that God is not there?
No, well, I mean, he's there. He's there.
Yeah.
Sticks and stones.
Yeah.
So that means he was there when the golden calf was created too,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But at the golden calf, we don't worship it because it's not Hashem. there's no vital force there. There's no Hashem.
Right, meaning worshiping something outside. So that's a good point. Meaning stones have God in it, but when you're worshiping a stone, you're not worshiping God within the stone. You're worshiping the stone. So yeah, that's considered idol worship.
Right.
But the idea of saying God is everywhere, like I don't think that's idol worship. That's the true unity of God. That there's godliness within everything, even within klipa. It doesn't mean you worship God within the klipa. You have to worship God in essence.
It's like when you're davening and if you look up at the sky or you look to
Yeah.
the east, you're not worshiping the sky,
Exactly.
but you're
Yeah.
worshiping
Yeah.
Hashem who's
Yeah,
there.
that's good. Yeah, well said. Michelle, did you have a comment on that? I saw you on mute. No, we're good. Okay. Anyone else? Questions before we continue? Okay, so now we're going to segue into chapter 8. These are deep stuff, but we're not going to just stop right there. We're going to go a little further. I'm going to tell you a quote from the Rogachever Gaon. The Rogachever Gaon passed away, I think, in 1933. He was literally, it means the Gaon means a genius. The Rogachever Gaon is considered the genius of Rogachev. His name was Rabbi Yosef Rosen, and I've mentioned him maybe just a few times. He was an incredible genius of Torah. Like his writings are so deep in Torah. He was a genius of Torah. You know, if he would have lived in times of the Talmud, he would have, been one of the contemporaries of Rabbi Akiva. Absolute genius. So I want to tell you what he says, but let me give you a little bit of a background. The broader a person's mind gets, the more you see how things are actually together, things are merged together. What I mean by that is when a child starts learning math, the way they're going to learn math is I have one pen, I have two pens, one pen, another pen equals two. And then you have one cup, you have another cup, one cup plus one cup equals two. It takes a while for the child to realize that it's an idea, that it's not about, oh, it's a coincidence that one cup and another cup equals two and a pen, and it's the same idea. But as a child, you don't realize that. It takes you a few, study pages of your book to realize that 1 + 1 is an idea that is everywhere. And then when you realize that, oh my gosh, it's all the one idea, you have to relearn that as you mature to subtraction and to multiplication. As you continue, you realize how it's all one idea. So the broader your mind gets, the more you see how things are actually merged. It's not different ideas. A lot of them are actually integrated as one idea. The Rogachever Gaon says that I believe, this is his words, he believes that the core of the Torah is one idea. If you learn every part of the Torah, you'll distill it to one theme, one point, one idea. But he says that I'm not smart enough to know that one idea. I mean, I can't distill it. The broader your mind gets, the more you can merge things. So he says, I'm not smart enough to see how it's all one idea. He could distill it into 10 ideas. And he distills the whole Torah into 10 points, 10 ideas. Because the more you understand, the more you could pool it into one. So that's what the Gaon of Rogachev says. The reason why I share that here is because this book is all about unity, oneness of God. Hashem Echad, it means that the more you understand of God, the more you see how God is one. Most of the book is about God's oneness within himself. But we're trying to find that within ourselves. We're trying to find godliness as one in ourselves. So we're always going to try to bring it back to that idea. Oneness of God is not just God is one and not two. It's not that there's two gods, as I said before. Even a child knows that. It's God is one vis-a-vis the world. Although our world may seem as a separate entity, it's really all part of God's oneness. It's all one with God. And just to give you a little bit of a summary of what we've learned in the first 7 chapters, we were preoccupied in chapter 1 with God interacting with the world. That God didn't just make the world in chapter 1, we learned, and walk away. God is constantly creating us, constantly creating world. And there's a perpetual energy of God that is maintaining world. And if God would leave that energy for a moment, the whole world would, and creation would become null and void. A next idea that was introduced in chapter 3, that the world is not a separate creation that God is then constantly creating. The world came from within God, which means everything in world, there's the source of world is not outside of God, is within God. So always we are within our source. How do we feel a sense of self if we are within our source? Like the sun ray within the sun, you don't call it a ray. So why do we call ourselves creation if we're within our source, if we're one in our source? So we answer that's because of Tzimtzum. Tzimtzum allows us the image as if we are from ourselves, that we don't have a source. But the truth is we don't have an identity outside of God. But now in chapters 8 through 12, which is till the end of the book, we're going to go even deeper. We're going to say not only within creation God is one, but even in what's spiritual, even what's metaphysical. It's all one with God. That the wholesomeness, when we say God is one, the unity is complete and absolute. That when we say God's expressions in the Torah, God is wise, God is kind, God is fair, God is honorable, those are not just emotions or attributes of God. Those emotions are totally one with God. The higher realms and worlds are totally one with God. Even the Hishtalshalut, which is literally Hishtalshalut would mean a chain of how God creates our world through a chain, like a chain of events, where there was a light, and then God creates vessels, and then if you've attended our evening class on JLI, we're learning about the idea of tohu, which is the original intention of creation, and then tikkun, which is the repaired place of creation. But in truth, it's all one continuum and one unity, totally one with God. So it exists from our perspective, but if you were able to go into God's perspective, you would see how everything is absolute one. The example we gave last week was about a teacher who's giving an illustration to explain something to their students. So for the student may take the illustration and say, wow, that was a great illustration, but lose track of what the point of the illustration was. Like a rabbi could give, a story in a class, and people come after and say that was a great story or that was a great joke, but losing sight of what the point of it was. But for the teacher, from the teacher's perspective, the illustration was all one with the idea. It was just a way of bringing out the idea further. But for the teacher, for the student, they could get caught up in the idea. So from our perspective, which is like the student perspective, we could get caught up in Tzimtzum and see things as separate. But if we were able to see things from the teacher's perspective, which is over here from God's perspective, you would see how Tzimtzum, which is like the illustration, is actually all continuum and part and parcel of unity of God. It's all wholesomeness within God. Any question on that? Is that clear so far? Okay, so in order to explain this in chapter 8, we explain one of the most famous Rambams. Rambam is Maimonides, and he explains a very famous idea that is a core teaching that is used in Tanya, that the words of the Rambam says like this: Hu amada, hu hayudea, hu hayudua, which means God's knowledge is not like our knowledge. The way we think of things Our knowledge is something outside of us. Vivian, tell me if this makes sense. Our knowledge always changes because our knowledge comes based on the experience that we have, based on what we know, based on what we see. Let me just see over here if I could explain that.
Like a vessel filling with water. Maybe.
Yeah, tell me more. What do you mean?
Oh, we're separate from our knowledge, like we're a vessel and the knowledge is the water
Exactly, it's separate.
filling us,
Exactly.
but Hashem is one piece. It's all one piece.
Exactly. Oh, that's a good example. Yeah, exactly. So every element of God in creation, God's expressions, are all one with God. But we can't, the Rambam says, we can't fathom that idea because everything we know is outside of us. All of our opinions or everything, our knowledge is all based on an experience we had. We won't know something unless we experience it, which is something that's outside of us. That's just how everything works within our realm. So within God, it's all one. God and his knowledge are one. It's not an outside thing like it is by us. So what's amazing, or I guess what I want to try to bring out of this, is we don't know how it works because we can't fathom it. Our knowledge and God's knowledge are totally different. So, but what the Alter Rebbe says over here is we at least have to try to understand what we don't know. I want to explain what that means. When I was 16, I was in summer camp in Montreal in the Laurentian Mountains, which is like 2 hours north of Montreal, and it was right on, the camp was beautiful ground. It's right on a lake. And this past summer, I went back to visit. Two of my boys are in that same camp. So it was my first time going back in 20 something years. It was really nice. But when I went there, I told the kids, you see this lake? I swam the whole lake. And if you look at it from the dock, it doesn't look that far. But once you jump in the water, it looks so far. It looks like it doesn't end. I don't know if you know what I mean, but until you jump in, you don't realize how vast something is. If you see the summit of Mount Ham from the 101, if I tell a family member, oh, I climbed to the top of Mount Ham, they're like, yeah, it doesn't look that high. But when you start the first 100 feet up the mountain, it's like, oh my gosh, this thing doesn't end. So once you start to climb, you realize how high the summit is. In our previous home, we lived right next to Mount Burdell, which is here in Novato. And I think the summit is, you guys both live in Novato way longer?
I don't know.
Maybe 1,400 feet. Does that sound right? But when you, from my house, it's like, oh, dude, I'm expecting my kids to be able to climb it on a Shabbos afternoon, get to the top of the mountain. But once you start climbing, you realize, Adrian, how long have you lived in Novato?
About 30 years.
Have you ever climbed Mount Ham?
No,
And what about Mount Burdell?
no.
I climbed them both, but I'm a trail runner.
Oh, that's right, Michelle. Okay, cool. So you would definitely know what I'm talking about, like the idea of, so I bring that over here is because we need to understand what we don't know. Meaning we're going to explore an idea that we're going to come out without a bottom line, but we need to at least climb the start of the mountain to realize just how high the summit is, and we're never going to get there. So we could just say we don't know, and that's called ignorance. Or then we could explore it and then say we don't know, and that's called educated ignorance.
So what was the saying again? Can you say that in Hebrew? I heard
Hu Amada.
Amada stand.
No, Mada is the knower, like the person who knows.
Yamada, okay.
He is the knowledge.
Uh-huh.
Hu Hayudua. He is the knower, the knowledge, and the known.
The knower.
Known?
Let me, I actually don't even have the book of the time. The known. Who said that? That was very good. I think that's what it is, right? The Rambam, the Alter Rebbe actually quotes it in chapter 2 of the first book of Tanya, but over there he just quotes it as a footnote. but the source of the extrapolation, or the source of the analysis of this Rambam, is actually from chapter 7 and 8 of the current book, which is Shari Yichud V'Emunah. I actually I don't even have the book. I wasn't expecting to learn it inside today, but it's on chapter 7 or 8, somewhere in there you'll find it.
The reason why I ask is I teach a class at my school called Building Wisdom for Vocational Living, and we're in the wisdom books. And starting out, most of the students think they know wisdom from their own personal experience. But that's not where wisdom starts. So as we start looking at Proverbs and, it shows where wisdom is. It's the fear of Hashem is where it starts. So then how do you get the fear of Hashem? Well, you have to read the book to know what he says, and so then they're kind of shocked that it's something outside of themselves. They think all the wisdom comes from themselves, or maybe someone who's gone down the road a little while, but they don't really get it that wisdom's outside of them and they have to bring it in. So that's why I was wondering, this statement sounded very intriguing to me.
Wow. So the theme, I'm just trying to explain it in how I understand it, but definitely learn the chapter inside and start with the Rambam. So the Rambam, Lynn, wrote 14 volumes called the Maimonides, the Mishnah Torah. The first of the 14 books is called Sefer Hamada. It's called the Book of Knowledge. And the opening section of the book talks about God as a knower. God, like, this is a source from the opening chapter of the Rambam. So I definitely encourage you, and I could send you a link, or on Chabad.org, you have the whole Rambam in English. It doesn't have a lot of commentary, and that's where the Alter Rebbe and Tanya comes in. But just seeing the source that is really cool. And if you could remind me right after the class, I'd be happy to send you a link just to get the source of where it is in the Rambam. So anything a human being can conceive, it's based on an experience we had. It's within our realm of what we see that's outside of us, and then we bring it in, just like you were saying. If I ask you to picture kindness, the only kindness you could picture is kindness that you experienced, or that someone else experienced. You could only think of things that you know. Or right now we're in touch with architects for a mikveh, and I just want to see a beautiful picture because that's how I know a mikveh. But the architect is showing me all these lines and numbers, and I'm like, well, I don't know what this is. But for another architect, this is beautiful, and for me, I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about. Or a musical notes, for me, it looks like gibberish, but for a musician, it's stunning art. It's stunning music. So it's only within the realm of what you know, of what your experience is, could you then take it in and appreciate it. So there's a positive to that, because you see something through your lens, through your experience, but it's also limiting. So Hashem is beyond what we can contrive. We can't understand because it's beyond our knowledge. Our kindness is way different than God's kindness. So we could compare it, but it's infinitely apart. So we're going to try to examine the human psyche as best as we can, but at the end of the day, we're going to come out realizing that we're limited and we can't relate to how it is in God's way. We're already almost over time. We have way more to study.
Really good though.
And it's deep stuff, and I encourage you guys to try to study the text inside. Chapter 7, which I think Vivian said takes up half the book, right? Is that what you told me last week? And then
Yeah, there's an addendum. That's also
so it's deep stuff, and there's more to learn on it. I don't want to, expound too much on it because, first of all, I don't understand it myself that much, but also, just getting deeper and deeper without actually getting to a bottom line. The point is to explain God's unity to the best way we can, and yeah, we'll take it as much as we can.
Thank you.
All right, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a great Wednesday. And for those that are coming to class tonight, we'll see you tonight.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
You too.
Perfect.